You hear the creak of wood behind you. Not the warm groan of a settling house, but something deliberate, purposeful. The leather straps are soft at first, almost gentle against your skin, before they tighten. Your wrists are pulled back, your spine forced into an arch that feels unnatural. Wrong. You can't scream yet, the pain hasn't arrived. But you know it's coming. This is Rome, and you have just spoken out of turn. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. It amazes me every single time that a story this dark, this buried, can reach someone halfway across the globe centuries later. The year is 89 BCE. The marble villas of Rome's Palatine Hill gleam under the Mediterranean sun. Their columns wrapped in silk, their courtyards perfumed with roses and imported spices. Inside these walls, power is absolute. Senators debate war and conquest. Slaves move like shadows. And women, no matter their birth or beauty, are expected to be silent, obedient, ornamental. But silence, as Rome was about to discover, is not the same as submission. And submission, when forced, has a way of echoing louder than any declaration of war. Her name was Julia Vittoria, though history would try to forget it. She was the wife of a senator, born into privilege, raised to manage a household with grace and efficiency. She had done everything expected of her married well, bore children, presided over feasts where men discussed the fate of nations while she poured their wine. But Julia had one flaw, one crack in the perfect surface of Roman womanhood. She questioned things, not loudly, not publicly. But when her husband handed her a cup of bitter liquid one afternoon and told her to drink, she asked what it was. When he said it was to cleanse the womb, she asked why. And when he insisted, she did something unthinkable. She refused. The room went silent. Not the comfortable quiet of understanding, but the dangerous stillness that precedes a storm. Her husband's face darkened. The slaves stopped moving. Julia set the cup down carefully, her hands steady, and waited. She didn't know yet that she had just crossed an invisible line, one that separated wives from property, persons from objects. But she would learn. That evening, 4 slaves came to her chambers. Their eyes were lowered, their movements mechanical. They didn't explain. They didn't apologize. They simply led her through corridors she had walked 1,000 times, past rooms where she had laughed and argued and lived, until they reached a part of the villa she had never seen, a small stone chamber lit by a single torch, smelling of sawdust and heated wood. Her husband was waiting. Beside him stood something new. It looked, at first, like a piece of furniture. Curved wood, polished smooth, with leather straps hanging from its sides like decorative trim. Almost elegant, almost harmless. Her husband gestured to it with the casual authority of a man showing off a new statue or imported table. "This," he said, his voice calm, almost educational, "will help you remember." Remember what? She wanted to ask. But the slaves were already moving toward her, and she understood that questions in this room were no longer permitted. They stripped her efficiently, without violence, but without mercy. When she tried to resist, hands simply multiplied 4 became 6. 6 became 8, until struggling seemed absurd. They positioned her over the curved wooden frame, and this is where the true genius of the device revealed itself. It didn't cut. It didn't burn. It simply held the body in a position the body was never meant to maintain. Her back arched unnaturally. Her shoulders pulled backward until the joints screamed. Her thighs were spread and strapped, her ankles locked, her neck forced down so she couldn't see anything but the stone floor beneath her. The pain started slowly, almost politely, a dull ache, a growing pressure. Then it bloomed into something that made her vision blur and her breath come in short, desperate gasps. But she didn't scream, not yet, because she could feel them watching her husband, the carpenter who had built this thing, the slaves who stood in the corners with their eyes carefully averted. And she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that her scream was what they wanted. Her breaking was the point. So she bit down until she tasted blood and stayed silent. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless when every second stretched into eternity. Her husband eventually left, bored by her stubborn quiet. The carpenter stayed longer, making notes, adjusting straps, testing the device's hold as if Julia were not a person but a prototype. And in a way, she was. Because what was happening to her in that stone chamber was not just punishment. It was invention. Her body was being used to perfect a machine that would soon spread through Rome like a whispered secret. A solution to a problem the empire's men had only just realized they had: wives who thought too much, questioned too often, refused too loudly. By morning, when they finally released her, Julia could barely stand. Her joints felt dislocated, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. But when her husband asked if she understood now, if she would be more careful with her words, she looked at him with eyes that had not softened. They had hardened, and something in that gaze made him turn away first. Within weeks, the device had a name: Disciplinaria Vittoria, the Victorian discipline. The carpenter, proud of his creation, had shown his sketches to other craftsmen. Those craftsmen had shown them to other patrons. And those patrons, senators and magistrates and wealthy merchants, had all found themselves suddenly interested. Not because they were cruel men necessarily, but because they had been raised in an empire that measured power by control, and control was easiest when it was absolute. If a wife could be quietly corrected, privately adjusted, return to obedience without the mess of divorce or the scandal of public punishment, then wasn't that civilized? Wasn't that progress? The modifications came quickly. Iron reinforcements for durability, a neck brace that locked, adjustable height for different body types. One version included a gag, though that was considered excessive by most. The point, they argued, was not to silence the woman forever, but to teach her when silence was appropriate. The distinction was important to them. It allowed them to believe they were educators, not torturers. Julia heard the rumors. She learned that other women were being strapped to replicas of the device that had been named after her suffering, her defiance, her involuntary contribution to Rome's evolving machinery of domestic control. Some of these women were wives like her. Others were slaves, widows, daughters who had dishonored their families. The criteria expanded as the device's popularity grew. It wasn't about specific crimes anymore. It was about correction, improvement, the reshaping of female will into something more manageable, more aesthetically pleasing to the men who governed the Republic. Then something unexpected happened. The device moved from private villa to public spectacle. It started small. A magistrate, proud of how effectively the disciplinarian had reformed his own household, suggested using it in minor legal proceedings. Women accused of theft, blasphemy, adultery, instead of execution or exile, they could be publicly disciplined, then released. Merciful, he called it, progressive. The crowds that gathered to watch these proceedings called it something else. Entertainment, because there is something about witnessing pain, especially pain inflicted on the powerless, that draws people in. They told themselves they were learning lessons about morality and consequence. But they came back week after week, and they cheered when the women finally broke. Julia was summoned to one of these spectacles 6 months after her own ordeal. Her husband, now celebrated as the man who had commissioned the original device, was invited to sit in a place of honor, and he was expected to bring her. Not as punishment this time, but as proof. Look, his presence said, look how well it works. She's still here. She's still obedient. Except Julia wasn't obedient. She was calculating. She watched as a young girl, no older than 16, was strapped into the device for stealing bread. She watched as the crowd leaned forward, hungry for the moment when dignity would collapse. She watched as men who wrote laws about justice and virtue applauded when the girl finally sobbed. And something inside Julia, something that had been compressed and folded and forced into submission, began to unfold. The next time she was summoned to appear publicly, this time at the request of a provincial governor who wanted to demonstrate the device to foreign dignitaries, Julia agreed. But she made one request. She wanted to speak. Afterward, she said, just a few words. The officials were confused, but saw no harm. Let the rehabilitated wife give testimony to the device's effectiveness. Let her thank the system that had corrected her. Julia smiled and said nothing more. The day arrived. The arena was small, not the grand Colosseum, but a stone theater outside the city walls. The crowd filled the seats, a mix of curious citizens and visiting officials. The disciplinarian stood at the center, polished to a gleam, its leather straps oiled and ready. Julia entered to applause, as if she were a performer rather than a survivor. She walked slowly toward the device, and the crowd grew quiet, anticipating. She reached out, touched the wood where her body had once been bent and held. She traced the leather straps that had marked her skin. And then she turned to face them. She didn't mount the device. She didn't kneel. She stood beside it, one hand resting on its frame like a speaker leaning on a podium, and she began to laugh. It wasn't hysterical laughter. It wasn't desperate or broken. It was clear, genuine, almost joyful. The kind of laugh that makes others uncertain whether they're in on the joke or the subject of it. The crowd shifted. Some people smiled nervously. Others frowned. The officials in the front row exchanged glances, and Julia kept laughing, her voice carrying across the stone seats, bouncing off the walls, filling the space with a sound that didn't belong there, sound of someone who had survived what was meant to destroy her and found the absurdity in it. When she finally stopped, the silence was absolute. She looked at the crowd, at the device, back at the crowd. "You built this," she said quietly, "because you were afraid of words, of questions, of women who might say no." She paused. "And now you've turned that fear into a show. But fear doesn't stop being fear just because you dress it up and sell tickets." She walked off the platform before anyone could respond, before the guards could move, before the officials could decide whether to applaud or arrest her. And as she disappeared through the arena's exit, something rippled through the crowd. Not agreement, not quite, but recognition. The understanding that they had just witnessed something that couldn't be unseen. Her name spread differently after that. Not as a cautionary tale, but as something else, a challenge, a question mark etched into the marble certainty of Roman authority. Other women began to speak of her in whispers. The way you speak of someone who might be myth or might be real, but is definitely dangerous. Dangerous not because she was violent, but because she refused to cooperate with her own erasure. The disciplinaria didn't disappear. It continued to be used, modified, refined. As Christianity spread through the empire, it was renamed, repurposed, called an instrument of penance rather than punishment. But the function remained the same: the breaking of will, the enforcement of submission, the quiet violence that leaves no visible scars. It appeared in different forms across centuries, in different cultures, under different names. Because the impulse it served, the need to control what cannot be argued with, has never really gone away. Julia. Vittoria vanished from official records sometime in the 1st century BCE. Her husband's estate documents don't mention her death. Her name doesn't appear on any tomb. It's as if she simply stopped existing, at least on paper. But in letters passed between women, in the accounts of midwives and slaves, in the scratched graffiti found on villa walls, fragments of her story survived, not as history, but as memory, as the echo of a woman who looked at the machine designed to break her and chose to laugh instead. Centuries later, a damaged scroll was found in a forgotten library in Alexandria. Most of it was illegible. The ink faded, the papyrus brittle with age. But one line remained clear, written in careful script. The machine taught them nothing. The silence did not last. No one knows who wrote it. No one knows if Julia herself ever saw those words. But someone remembered. Someone chose to write it down, to carry that defiance forward through time, preserved not in bronze or marble, but in the simple, stubborn act of refusing to forget. The device is gone now. Or perhaps it isn't. Perhaps it's simply evolved, taken new shapes, found new vocabularies. But Julia's laugh, that sound that didn't belong in the arena, that refused to cooperate with its own silencing, that sound is still echoing, still reminding us that some things, once heard, cannot be unheard. Some voices, once raised, cannot be lowered. And some women, no matter how many machines are built to bend them, will always find a way to stand.